As I said earlier, acceptance and support of different management action really, in my opinion, depends on current conditions. And what we did is we did conjoint modeling, similar to state of choice, state of preference modeling, comes out of the marketing literature, where we asked hypothetical scenarios, where we varied 4 different situational factors: use level, litter, coral damage from recreation, and facilities. And 2 impact levels per factor, and I just put low, high, good, poor. We quantified that as well in the survey. Now, if we asked, and I'm going to show you an example of the scenarios, but if we were to ask all possible combinations, it would have to ask 16 scenarios in the survey. That's far too long for an on-site survey. People would start beating us up. So what the software does, it creates an orthogonal design and spits out the X number of scenarios you have to ask, and it can predict responses for all the others based on the scenarios you ask. After each scenario, we ask people to rate the acceptance and management actions. So if use level was really bad and there was a lot of litter and the coral was trashed from recreation and the facilities were in bad disrepair, how acceptable would it be to provide more education, limit use, improve upkeep, provide more facilities? And the subset predicts all responses for all combinations. So this is kind of what the scenario looked like in the survey, although after each of these factors we'd had numbers based on previous literature. So this is the worst case scenario: lots of people, litter, substantial recreation damage to reef, and poor condition of facilities, and then people would rate each of these actions. And so there was 8 of these in the survey. For the 1 management action, education, increase education and awareness, what I'm going to show here is how important, and these are put in percentages, but they're based on utility values, how important each of these factors were in influencing acceptance of the management action. And we can see here, surprisingly, in my opinion, for education and awareness, the most important one was recreational damage to reefs from, damage to reefs from recreation. So as damage to reefs from recreation increased, acceptance of providing more education and awareness increased, and that was the dominant factor at acceptability of education. The reason why this surprised me is in all terrestrial studies, litter is by far and away the most important one. Litter always dominates people. When they see anything to do with litter on a survey in a terrestrial landscape, they glom onto that and say, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. I saw a piece of litter, because it's very polarizing. In fact, we found litter to be the least important factor in the marine settings, which is groundbreaking in the recreation literature. For limiting use, not surprisingly, the most important factor was use level, if use level is really high. But again, what's interesting here, and I met with DAR yesterday, they were shocked how high reef damage was for use level as well. So those are the 2 major ones in influencing acceptance of limiting use. Improving upkeep, the most important one was facility condition. Not surprisingly, if the facilities are in bad shape, improving upkeep becomes more acceptable. And more facilities, same kind of thing, facilities condition. What's interesting is the conjoint model also spits out a quasi-Pearson R fit ratio. It's not the similar like correlation Pearson R, to see how well the models fit. And you can see here across the sites it was 0.98 to 0.99, which is screaming high for social science. Usually they're in the 0.6 range, which means the models worked really, really well. And it was kind of an experiment. This has never been done in our field before. What's also interesting is all the results I presented up to now there were some site differences. For the management actions, there's no differences among the sites. And that's important for managers, because what we can see is that no matter what site you kind of look at least based on these 3, the general support for the management action is going to be the same across sites. So that's important for managers. My last results slide is to get away from the conjoint and present this in a much more digestible manner, and using the potential for conflict index, PCI, which is a statistic I created with a couple other statisticians. And what it is, we can just plot the scale that people filled out the answers on the survey on this axis. And down here I've just presented 3 scenarios. This is the best case scenario. Everything's in pretty good shape. This is the worst. Everything's in bad shape. And here is kind of a middle case scenario. And what you get is these funky bubbles, and there's 2 measures associated with these bubbles. The middle of the bubble is the mean on this scale. So what this is saying, that for education and awareness, even under the best case scenario, people think that's still acceptable, which means no matter how good conditions are, no matter how bad conditions are, you need to provide education and awareness of users. All right? The size of the bubble corresponds to the number 0.15 here, and that's the potential for conflict index. It ranges from 0 to 1. 0 meaning everyone's in agreement, 100%, almost like a standard deviation of 0. a value of 1 means there's complete disagreement. If you did something along the lines of that management action, you're going to annoy a lot of people and you're going to please a lot of people. There's tremendous disagreement. What we can see here is saying that for this scenario, people think it's acceptable, and there's general consensus for that. As conditions get worse, acceptability increases, and there's more consensus. So if conditions get really bad, then there's more consensus that, okay, you got to provide some more education. And we look at the same thing for improving upkeep. Again, all still positive, even under worse conditions. Even under the best conditions, they still think that at all these sites we need to improve upkeep and maintenance at all the sites. More facilities, getting more to the neutral point here. People are a little more conflict. The bubble's getting bigger. More disagreement about the appropriateness of adding facilities. Here's the biggie, though. When we often talk about carrying capacity, the first thing that comes to people's minds is, well, just limit use, just reduce use, have a quota, put in fees, limit parking, do something to reduce the use. What actually we're seeing is that's the most controversial action, and I would caution against anyone taking that action. There's lots of other creative solutions we can get at with zoning and education and stuff that are far more digestible for the public. Under best case scenario, limiting use is totally unacceptable, and there's a fairly big blob here, which means that there's a fair amount of controversy. This is the biggie, because this scenario, or ones around this scenario, similar to this, like scenario 1 and 7, are all kind of like this. You notice that it's right on the middle point and the bubble's big, which means that you've got half of the people at the site saying, yeah, limit use, the other half saying, no, don't limit use. And so tremendous amount of controversy, and that's kind of that's the scenario, or those scenarios like that are what we're seeing right now at all these sites. So my message to DAR was, don't limit use, because you're going to have a lot of people banging on your door. Let's think of some other creative stuff. Only under worst case scenario does limiting use become acceptable, but even then there's still a bit of controversy about the appropriateness of that restrictive action. So my last slide here is just a brief summary. Is most users had visited the site before. It kind of surprised me, being a visitor who used to come as a tourist to Hawaii a lot. I kind of thought at some of these sites most of the people would be tourists. No, a lot of them are residents of Hawaii, and a lot of them have been to the sites before. However, main activities do differ among the sites. There is some conflict of sites, especially board sports at Kailua and Diamond Head, that need attention. Social carrying capacity is within limits at all sites, and this kind of surprised some folks at DAR yesterday who thought all these places there's just too many people here, people are getting frustrated because there's lots of people. The data don't support that. We are approaching some issues at Sharks Cove and Sans Souci, though. There are facility capacity problems at some of the sites that need attention, especially facilities at Diamond Head and things like parking at Waimea Bay. User education is by far and away the most acceptable management action, especially to deal with reef impacts from recreation. Limiting use is by far and away the most controversial action unless things get really bad. There's substantial crowding and overuse. Now, there is more analysis to be completed. We've asked questions on user displacement, how people have shifted patterns based on current conditions, and value orientations toward reefs. Now, I'm going to digress here for 2 seconds before wrapping up. That I was talking with Mike earlier today. I played a little bit around with the value orientation stuff on the plane over here because I couldn't sleep and I just wanted to run some statistics. It's kind of the geek in me. And what value orientations are, I mean, an easy way to describe it is patterns and basic beliefs, and you can classify people on continuums from sort of biocentric protection to anthropocentric use. And I've done a lot of work in this area in wildlife, and we see people scattered along these continuums and how it relates to demographics. So rural places of middle America tend to be more use-oriented toward wildlife. Urban West Coast cities tend to be more protection-dominated. What's interesting is there's no one in the use orientation at any of these sites for coral reefs. In fact, when you put people on a continuum, it kind of starts at the middle point and everything moves up to protection. And the largest group at all these sites is the protection toward coral reefs, to the point where they want the protection of the coral reef over and above their own personal recreation experience. So that's interesting news. Now, there's more work to be done on that. The scales that I created, basically I took the wildlife value orientation stuff and converted it to coral reefs. The reliability, Cronbach alpha reliabilities were all 0.8, 0.9, which means it's a pretty cool scale. So it seems to be working. More work to be done yet with that. But with that, I will take any questions or comments.